Cather's dates are 1873 to 1947. So born shortly after the Civil War and died shortly after the end of the Second World War. It's the nature of literature to often date itself relative to conflict, and that she grew up in a period where migration to the West was very vibrant, and she died when the nation was well on its way into the 20th century. She's what would be called a modernist, that is someone born at the end of the 19th century, but writing most of her work around the time of the first, or the period after the First World War. I'll tell you a lot more about her and some more about the context of the book, but I wonder, since this is a book that is often on high school and college syllabi in a variety of contexts, sometimes an introduction to American literature, sometimes an introduction to reading, that high school students find it, if they read it, very welcoming. It's not a complicated book. It's not modernist the way that Fitzgerald's novels are modernist. So I wonder how many of you have read this novel before in an academic environment? So only a few. And how many of you read it on your own before you had to read it for this? So a few more. So I want to say that it's my experience that people who like this book really like this book, and many people are unaware of the book because it lies below the radar. If you know A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith, a one-hit wonder, a first book that made it big when she was advised not to write about her own life, but to make it a novel, saying that there was more of a market for novels and memoirs. So she took her own life, changed it slightly, and she wrote what became a massive bestseller. It was sent to overseas soldiers during the Second World War, and it was the first book ever published in a pocketbook format, so it could fit into the pockets of a regulation Army uniform. They measured it. Pocketbooks began with Betty Smith's Tree Grows in Brooklyn. She hadn't been heard of before. She was an unknown playwright. Willa Cather had some of the same faith, and I wonder if we could start, before I give you some context, that you share with us this evening how you found My Antonia, whether you read it before or not, in whatever context. And please speak up. You can just start talking unless it gets a traffic jam. You can raise your hand. But would anyone like to start by saying how you found the reading of the book, a question you can't get wrong?
Well, I'll start. I think I'd heard about it, and I read it when I was much younger, partly because my ethnic heritage is both Italian and Slovak.
Oh.
And this was a book about folks who were from what would now be called Czechoslovakia.
Right.
And for that reason, I just wanted to read it to get a sense about that.
How old were you when you read it?
Oh, I was probably 25 years old.
Okay.
I discovered Willa Cather when I was living in Nebraska in my early 20s, and I think I had read Oh Pioneer and was just enraptured with her language, her poetic prose, and then I discovered My Antonia, and also Giants in the Earth by Rolvog. So really kind of into this Midwestern kind of prairie days.
Yes, and can I ask you, how old were you when you were born in Nebraska?
Probably 22.
And you were born in Nebraska?
No, originally from Iowa though, so very much a part of my roots.
I see. O Pioneers came first. O Pioneers has an exclamation point at the end of the title because it is a celebration of their hardiness. My Antonia is a celebration of the immigrant spirit too, Bohemia, as Czechoslovakia used to be called, but it's also very much about the bonding between Jim Burden, the fictional character who narrates the book, and My Antonia. Other comments about how you found it? Just speak up.
It was on a high school summer reading list.
There you go.
And I just ate up summer reading list.
Was there an incentive to do the summer reading list?
You had to.
That works remarkably well.
You had to pick two fiction, a play, a poetry collection.
And this was in high school?
This was in high school.
Uh-huh.
And I just read myself through a lot of books. Robot, I read Death Comes from the Archbishop. I read, I read everything I could possibly.
And what's your memory of having read this back? Had you read this between then and now?
Yeah,
Oh.
I read it because I stuck it on a choice reading list for when I was teaching senior English. And not many people picked it up, but the ones that did loved it.
So what's your memory of your first reading of it or subsequent readings? What did you like?
I loved it. I
Loved
just
it.
loved it. I loved the character. I think I just felt very, very close to her and wanted to see her succeed. Wanted to see.
Cather or
her
Antonia?
Antonia.
No, I wasn't making a joke, yeah.
No, Antonia.
Yeah. Let me say that when my son was in high school at Hamden Hall, they had a January break and they had a January reading list. And the incentive was that if you wrote a book report on 3 of the books, you would get an extra something on your grade. And of course, I was an English teacher at the time, as he knew. He also knew that I couldn't help him in any substantial way with his writing or reading. So he comes home from school, puts the list under my face, and tells me what he needs to do. And I'm looking for good books, and he says, I want 3 books that are short. I swear to you. He is a Yale graduate, has a law degree from Jacob Javits, and is a practicing attorney in New York, but he wanted short books. And I said to him, honestly, I don't remember books by their length. And he said, come on. Yes, you do. Anyway. Yeah.
I don't know if you're looking at me. I read it in high school in Palmer, Nebraska. It was required reading, and that's where I grew up. I was very proud that this was a Nebraska writer
Yes.
writing about all of this good stuff about rural Nebraska. But the one thing and then I read it again before tonight because I'd forgotten it.
Cather, like Jim, was born on the East Coast,
Yeah.
but went to Nebraska.
But
She
what-
was 9.
What they didn't tell us in Nebraska, I had to come east to find out, was how cool this woman was, how bohemian. They never told us all that stuff. And that's what I think is interesting about her, that she is this really cool person, but she wrote about the old stuff, the old country,
Yeah.
growing up.
Do you people from Nebraska live in Guilford anyway? Was there a special bus to see you?
I was
Yes.
just gonna say, for someone who grew up in New York City for 25 years, it gave me a real appreciation for Nebraska. It's just the depiction, instead of just being flat
Yeah.
cornfields.
Yeah.
It's very beautiful.
Yes.
I was struck by the author's choice to kind of bury the story. We see her through his eyes, looking back over years. You don't get to see inside Antonia's head. You're always in the head of this guy. And then I read elsewhere that same thing with The Great Gatsby, that the pushing the main character behind a curtain kind of.
Right. And, one of the things she did is she made it about the relationship. And when you read a book that's called My Antonia, the speaker is not going to be Antonia, which makes her both more mysterious or distant, but also more intimate, because clearly Jim Burden has extraordinary affection for this girl. He's 9, he's 10, she's 13, and you can just imagine what that age differential would be like in any boy and teenage girl. And it made her the subject of the book without being the narrator. Now, Willa Cather invented a narrator, Jim Burden, in order to distance herself from Antonia and make it again about the relationship. You can't have a relationship with someone without distance. You can only have a relationship with someone who's not you. I'm reminded, and this will show you the rich literary background I have, that I Love Lucy was called I Love Lucy because when the executives told Desi Arnaz, apparently a hot-blooded, temperamental Cuban, that they wanted Lucy to be the title of the show, he said, I need to be in the title too. And they compromised with I Love Lucy. The I is Ricky Ricardo, like my Antonia. Willa Cather was born and migrated, not as an orphan, but to live with her grandparents at the age of 9. One of the things you have to appreciate about America that is not sufficiently emphasized or understood is we are one of the countries of the world that was a nation before it was a country. I'm going to say that again. We were a nation, 1776, when we hadn't yet really been a country. Most countries of the world, certainly in Europe, including many in Africa and South America, had a long history as a country, that is, as a ground, as a landscape, as a territory. Pays is a French word for country or countryside. A paysan is a person who comes from your land, actual land. The idea of a peasant, which originally was not insulting, was a person of the land. And people identified their homeland as a land. Well, America didn't have much land, and certainly not a conception of land, until the migration westward happened. Nebraska became a state. Any Nebraskans want to tell me when that was?
1867?
Yeah, 1860 something. I believe you, 67. So one thing you have to understand that in 1918, when the country had been through a war that it won, but it really didn't get much involved in. We weren't involved for most of the war. It was over there, as George M. Callahan could tell you. It was not fought on our soil. It was a distant war, but it gave Americans in 1918 a sense of a national identity. We were America, and we helped win the First World War over there. Novel was published in 1918. People were very eager in that period of time to learn about the country that they knew existed but didn't know. And so the idea that Nebraska at that time was the western frontier. It wasn't Midwest because there was not enough west on the other side of it. And people were very interested in finding out about other parts of America. Sarah Orne Jewett published in 1896 the wonderful novel, The Country of the Pointed Fur, that is Maine. How many of you know that book?
Country of the Pointed
Nobody from
Fur.
Maine here tonight, I guess. That bus will be here shortly. The Country of the Pointed Furs is a wonderful book about a New York woman who visits a particular sea town in Maine on a regular basis, and so she becomes an inside-outsider. That is, someone who's a visitor to the town, but so often that she becomes a regular, in the same way that Jim Burden is a kind of inside-outsider. People loved reading that book because they thought of Maine as another country, which essentially it was. You've been there. Nebraska was another country to the readership that identified in the shape of the original colonies. The first Western published in America is credited as The Virginian by Owen Wister, published in 1902. Why was the first Western not called the Oklahoman or the Texan? Because the people who wanted to know about the West were the people from Philadelphia, the people from Virginia, the people from New York. The West was created for Eastern readers. And although there were dime novels, basically comic books, well before Owen Wister, like Twister without the T, published The Virginian, people did not get a sense of the West as a place until Owen Wister published his book, The Virginian. It has the first showdown in Western literature. It has the line, when you say that to me, smile, right? If you're going to insult me, smile so I know you're just kidding. And it has him courting a schoolmarm. People learned about a part of America that they didn't know about through reading novels. And the same thing is true with my Antonia. Willa Cather went to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and for a time she dressed as a male, and she signed herself as Will Cather. The signing her name was very short-lived, but identifying as a male in gender coding lasted longer, and although she toyed with working as a medical doctor, and she had an unofficial internship with a surgeon, and she toyed with being a musician, she graduated with a degree, a Bachelor of Arts in English, and she went on to be a very successful editor and short story writer, and for the last half of her 70-year-plus life, she lived with a domestic partner openly, and was not in any way that I know of had her critical reputation, her public reputation hurt by that. I think one of the reasons, so she decided to make this book narrated by someone not Antonia for reasons I've already explained. She wants to talk about what kind of effect, charismatic effect, this very simple but powerful figure, Antonia, would have on someone else. And I think she made it a male, not to give the narrative voice more authority, but to remove any sense that there was woman-on-woman infatuation. I think that might have been something that concerned her. I don't know this. Jim Burton, the name suggests that maybe there was some onus in taking on that role. But like Huckleberry Finn and many other American novels, Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby, the I narrator is very American. Walt Whitman says I. Emerson talks about I. Nick Carraway, Huckleberry Finn, Holden Caulfield tell their own stories. That I is very American. So this idea of talking about not just the state of Nebraska, but the land, and to give a sense of the land, and the terrain, and the climate. Mr. Miller is done in by the cold and the weather. I remember the first time I read as an extract, The Wolf Attack on the Wedding Party. Is there anyone here who hasn't read the novel? It takes your breath away. And if you're someone sitting in Philadelphia or Bayonne, New Jersey, or pick your city, and you're reading about a contemporary work of literature that in the 1880s, I mean, not set back 30 years, that people were dying from being attacked by wolves on a sled coming back from a wedding journey, you're going to pay attention. So it has some sensational bits. It has a lot about women's treatment. It extols implicitly the role of pioneer women in the cultivation of America, something that's not always talked about adequately, and a lot of people came at it from that angle. Having said that, and she went on to publish many other books, and is well known, I think one of the reasons she doesn't rise to the pantheon of the famous modernists like Fitzgerald, or Faulkner, or Hemingway, or Sherwood Anderson, all great writers, is she is writing historical fiction, and she's writing what you might call geographical fiction. That's not what Fitzgerald is writing about a class of very wealthy people. Faulkner is writing historical fiction of a very narrow kind. I don't mean paltry or thin. He's writing about Southern history infused with racism. He's not writing expansive celebration of America, quite the opposite. Hemingway writes different kinds of fiction, but you wouldn't think of him mainly as someone writing about the land. And so Willa Cather is mining her own arena, but it's not the arena that gets the attention of people who talk about the modernist great writers of America. You may know the work of Sherwood Anderson. Winesburg, Ohio is absolutely a masterpiece. Some years ago, in one of my previous 100 visits, we did some stories from Winesburg, Ohio. He was considered a small writer because he wrote very, very understated prose and largely wrote short stories, although he did write some novels. And he never broke into the highest pantheon of Hemingway, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, even Gertrude Stein. And he wrote in a letter to a friend who congratulated him on being published that said, Sherwood, you're one of the published writers of America. Feel proud. And he wrote back, you will not know the agony of what it is to be ranked in the very first level of the second-rate writers of America. Yeah. You can laugh, but he wasn't making a joke. He was pained that his kind of writing, which he was great at, was not considered great writing. And Willa Cather, for a time, suffered from that same description, although most people today would say she is one of the great modernists. She brings a sensibility of someone who herself was a migrant to Nebraska. She had a great love for Nebraska, but she brought an Eastern sensibility, which is why, in the same way that Fitzgerald loved the world of the 1920s, the Jazz Age, loved the very wealthy, loved the beautiful and the damned, and at the same time he despised it. He hated the frivolity and the lack of virtue in the Jazz Age. And his love-hate for it is encapsulated in having Nick Carraway be an outsider to Jay Gatsby. Jay Gatsby has followed the Kool-Aid, and Nick Carraway is at a distance. It's the same thing with Jim Burton and Antonia. Jim experiences as an outsider, one who comes back many years later to see a mature Antonia. And so again, you don't just get the woman or the man, boy, girl, you get the relationship. So having said that, people were eager to read it at the time because it was a world they didn't know, but it was America. And those of you who traveled much know that there are many Americas. If you go to Santa Fe or anywhere in the American Southwest, and then you go to northern Minnesota, it doesn't feel like the same country. We're not the only country like that. I'm not saying that we're distinct that way, but this is a novel that makes you confront the land in the same way that Huckleberry Finn makes you aware of the fact that it matters how far down the Mississippi River you travel in the years before the Civil War. And if you go too far, and they do, it's a different world completely. You actually cross the frontier. So I'm going to stop there with that little bit of context and ask if anyone wants to say more about the novel generally or any of the particular episodes. She was quoted as saying it's not a novel with a plot. She purposely chose vignettes, that same idea of smallness, episodic kind of narration. So would anyone like to say something more about the novel now that I've set the table a little bit? Yes.
Well, the wolf attack really struck me because.
Well, I hope so.
Because it felt so real.
Yeah.
And I always thought, oh, those Europeans, they worry about wolves. I thought it was a frivolous thing from other things that I had read.
Yeah.
And that was so dreadful. And
Yeah.
you could see that, if you have 50 wolves chasing a couple of slaves, they had no chance.
Yeah, the fear of wolves in Eastern Europe was so palpable that when people in the 18th and 19th century became mentally ill, and especially those people who became mentally ill from a free-floating anxiety, their anxiety directed itself towards wolves. And some of those people, most often men, went into the woods, stripped their clothing, let their nails grow long, let their hair grow long, and were seen, like the Yeti, as man-wolves, men who look like wolves. The were in werewolf is the German root for men. In Beowulf, when you pay a price for killing your enemy family member, you pay Vergeld, man money. And the legend of the werewolf arose from the fact that the greatest terror of many people in Eastern Europe was the wolf. Brothers Grimm. What happens when you go into the woods? Stephen Sondheim knows what happens. It's not a musical. It's terrifying. And people in America, unless they were themselves immigrants or well-traveled, would not have known that. So in the midst of this celebration, muted, but a celebration of immigrant life and how tough it is, how hard it is to break land that's not been broken, what it's like to be cheated by people who are taking advantage of you, the special circumstances of young women. People were reading that with an interest in, this is a country that is now part of my nation that I don't know enough about. I was a graduate student at Columbia, and one year for Halloween, the graduate students were invited to a departmental party where you were allowed to read a short excerpt from a work that you thought was very scary. And most people picked well-known scary writers, fill in the blank with Poe and other people. And I read the passage of the wolves. And a good number of my fellow graduate students didn't know that it came from my Antonia, which I didn't tell them until the end. And they had always thought of my Antonia as a book for girls or women or about Nebraska. It is terrifying, I agree with you. Yes?
I was very moved by the book, mainly the reminiscence of the past. In fact, I had trouble reading book 5, part 5, because my eyes teared up after they reunited the first time.
Very moving. I agree with you. It moved me too.
It really hit me very well.
Yeah. If you put yourself in the position of Willa Cather as the actual historical migrant, or of the fictional Jim Burden, riding a train across a significant expanse of the country to go from Virginia, which in 1883, let's say, was very well established. It had been more than 100 years since the colonies, to go to Nebraska, which was known to be a tough climate on the edge of America, And to go as a young boy, again, he was, in the novel, he's 10, Willa Cather herself was 9, and the kind of courage and audacity it took to make that trip, even if he was forced to. And there are several scenes where he contemplates what it's like to lie in the landscape of the prairie and look up at the sky. And the immensity of the continent, even if you're only experiencing one parcel of land at a time. Wallace Stevens has a poem called The Comedian, by which he means the actor in comedies, not the stand-up comedian, as the letter C. That is, reduce a person to its narrowest form. And the immigrant from Italy, in that poem, goes aboard on top of a ship, goes topside, having been kept down in steerage, and sees the sea and no land anywhere around it. I have a friend here tonight who took a cruise recently and had that experience. And that character feels that he's been annihilated by the nothingness of the sea, that it's so vast that he's always been raised near land or on land, that he feels himself wiped out, and he's coming to America. He's coming to the New World, and his first experience is being erased by the vastness of the sea, that is the opposite of land. Nobody thinks they're going to sea as a permanent place. You're going to America to be on land. Land ho, this is my land. These are my fellow people of the land. This is my homeland. Very moving in this poem about annihilation on the way there.
I liked in the,
Go ahead.
A little louder for me?
I'm over here.
Oh, thank you.
I liked I was interested in the book about the divide between the low-class immigrants and the establishment. We'll call them Yankees, I'm sure there's probably a better word. And Jim Burden's swing on that, because in the very beginning, he's introduced as somebody who's married to some kind of battle axe. The other guy who's with him on the train says, I'm not too close with Jim because I really don't like his wife. But then in the book, Jim keeps telling you how much he admires the vivacity of the immigrants and how dull and boring his class of people is. And it's obvious that there's never gonna be a romance between him and Antonia. A lot of give and take on that subject.
Yeah.
What about when, Antonia goes to work for, is it Mr. Cutter? And he's the one who puts his wife on a train, a one-way train to Kansas, I think, Kansas City. But, and then he's the one who also, gets her pregnant later, I believe, right? No?
Not he is. He tried.
One
So who-
came back to he wanted her to be alone.
Yeah.
Oh.
Jim Burton's in a bed.
I just wonder if Antonia, was abused when she was working for them, living with them. It was kind of an unsaid, it was not explicit, but I wondered, if that could have been a possibility, but I guess maybe I got it a little confused, but, so who was the father? Because then
She had a relationship with
If someone's answering that question, just speak up so everyone
Oh,
can hear
so
you.
it was Donovan.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, she had a relationship.
He left her,
And then he
her at
left.
the altar.
Yeah.
He left her at the altar, I think.
You know, it's a sad fact of life, and not just American life. You can always wonder what happened to young women or girls, or even younger girls, given the history of the world. Not an American experience, it's a male-female experience. And especially when you're somewhere where there isn't yet an established custom or code of ethics or legal system. They were Roman Catholics in a Protestant area of the world, and Roman Catholics in the 19th century in Protestant areas were often subject to discrimination, and not just in the 19th century. That was not uncommon. One of the groups despised by the KKK was the Roman Catholic Church and Roman Catholics. That was another issue. Also, they are not European in the sense of French, German, English, because many immigrants on the eastern shores of the United States came from those countries. And it's an interesting study to see the waves of, in decade by decade, what the primary immigrants are, and how it took a while for Eastern Europe to catch up to be the primary immigrants to America, many of whom were Jewish Americans, and that created its own bias and ghettos and stereotypes and so on. The history of America is a history of immigration and also discrimination, not surprisingly. Not to take it casually, but being students of history or everyday life in America, not surprisingly. Yes.
I really enjoyed the close bond that Antonia and her father share.
Yes.
I mean, the my Antonia is from her father, and then Jim Burton adopts that when
Yeah,
he
that's right.
Relates to Antonia as my Antonia.
Thank you for adding that, that's right.
He was, and then when you find out his backstory, how he was more of, I guess, almost an aristocrat, and married the mother that he had gotten pregnant, that her mother was pregnant, and so he did the right thing, he married her.
Right.
And she is just such a battle axe that, you know.
That's a bohemian word, you could look at that.
Yes. But I was really moved by his death.
It is very moving.
Yes.
It's a death by suicide.
Yep.
He's a Roman Catholic. That's another issue. There's no priest close enough to give him last rites, which must have been very painful to the family. And he's buried at an intersection, which is where suicides are buried.
Right.
And when you think about the person he is in the novel and how he is seen by other people, including Jim, it's very poignant.
Yep.
It's very poignant.
He's the one who played the violin, right? The
Yes.
musician, the,
Yes.
you know.
And there are enough people in this room with enough life experience of different kinds that all of us have met immigrants in our lifetime who were something impressive in terms of their ability, their education, their personal success, their financial success, their social status, and come to America. They were physicians in Thailand, and now they're a busboy. Everybody here has met people like that, and so much of it is because they're from Thailand, or Uruguay, or fill in the blank. They have the credentials, and I worked for a while as a cook in a monastery, not a cloistered monastery, in New York City, the one that has a soup kitchen near Madison Square Garden. And I worked as a fill-in weekend chef for my brother-in-law to have vacation. And the guy who was the dishwasher had an advanced degree in engineering in the South American country, which I forget just because I'm old. And the only job he could get was as a dishwasher when he first came here. And I had my own biases and suppositions of what a poorly spoken English, Spanish, South American immigrant washing dishes would have been in a prior life until he told me. And I would not have guessed that he had an advanced degree in engineering. I think that's a very common story.
I was a employment counselor for 34 years, and I interviewed so many people.
Just a little louder for me?
Yeah, I was an employment counselor for 34 years.
Oh.
And so I started when I was 29, and so over my career, I interviewed so many people, and I can't tell you how many people I've interviewed whose story was like that. And I gained so much respect for people. I mean, people from all over, Ukraine, Iraq, Morocco, everywhere. And, but what was rewarding was I was able to help them by learning, whether bettering English, getting their high school diploma, going on for training or education. And so it was a really rewarding career in that way. But you're right, that a lot of us have these preconceived notions about, a dishwasher or whatever. And then you find out, like you said, that they did so many other things.
And even more powerfully, we have a preconceived notion about what it is to be an American. And we think that Americans are a majority culture. They're white, they're well established. You may not think their particular religion or gender, but most people have a clear sense, most Americans have a clear sense of what it is to be an American, and many of them define that by who they exclude. When the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower, they were a majority of the people on the ship, but they were not the only people on the ship. Some 70 people, some number like that, of the 100 plus, were the Pilgrims coming for religious freedom. Others were entrepreneurs, other people escaping persecution but not part of the Puritan community, and many people were running the ship, as you'd expect. And before they landed at Plymouth Rock, the Puritans decided to create a contract in which they identified themselves as saints with a capital S. They were God's people. They were interested in purifying the Protestant church even beyond the purification that had been done by Henry VIII in forming the Anglican Church. And they wanted to remove all hints of ritual and iconography and papacy. And they referred to the other people on the ship as what? Strangers with a capital S. They wanted to make clear that the compact was among the saints, the living saints, and excluded the strangers, capital F. I taught American studies for many years in different institutions. It is remarkable that before the Pilgrims set down on land, before there was even a colony, let alone in America, we were choosing the ins and the outs. red states, green states, hawks and doves, this person, that person. Because America defined its community by who it excluded. And when Anne Bradstreet heard that the Congregationalists had a model that any group of people who got together and said we're a church, was a community. You didn't need a pope, but you didn't even need a bishop or an elder. You only needed the consent of the community. Any number of people could do that. And Anne Bradstreet said, essentially, how about, can the number be one? Can I be my own church? And like Oliver asking for more, people went crazy. What? One? No, you have to be a community. You can't be one. Emily Dickinson said you can't. Emily Dickinson said the soul selects her own society. And she is writing about the time this novel is set. No, and you have to have a community. And she decided to leave. And that notion of America being defined by who's in and who's out, you may have heard Dick Gregory's wonderful comment on cowboys and Indians and whites and blacks, and what happened during the Vietnam War is that we found out that the people we were on the outside of were our own children. That America's opposition was not about this group and that group, but parents and children, and the country went into a kind of trauma. When Thomas Jefferson was composing the Declaration of Independence, the original trio of what all Americans were guaranteed was life, liberty, and what?
Pursuit of happiness.
Sorry?
Pursuit of happiness.
No, that's not the original. I know that one too. Property. Life, liberty, and property is what they were guaranteed. You could have land. And then he got nervous because he knew that property meant living human beings, which he himself owned. And he decided it would be a bad look for the country to form a new democratic nation with the term life, liberty, and living human beings. So they changed it to pursuit of happiness. What is pursuit of happiness but desire? And desire is a great motivating force in American culture. It's what animates coming to America, what animates Disneyland. It's what animates the idea that there's a great American novel. You know, Yugoslavia does not have a great Yugoslavian novel. I don't mean they don't have a great novel. They don't think of the great Yugoslavian novel. Only America has capital letter G, A, and great American novel. Because we want to be great. It's the nation, it's founded by desire. When the Pilgrims came over, the enemy to their holiness was desire. Desire was what got you into trouble. The self was the enemy of the soul. And a lot of being saintly was repressing desire. Two great plays in America have desire in the title. Desire Under the Elm and A Streetcar Named Desire. Americans are fascinated by desire, including the desire to pursue happiness, to become American, and at the same time there's a great undercurrent in America about being suspicious of desire. So before I break, I will tell you that for years I taught a course that was called Pioneers and Pilgrims about America in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. Two of the great types of American people are the Pilgrims who founded Plymouth Rock. Every grade school student learns about it. They learn the myths and stories, and the idea that we had a first Thanksgiving, we befriended the Indians before we killed them with the diseases we brought. The idea that the Pilgrim people were on an errand into the wilderness, and they were pilgrims to a holy place. They were going to make a city on the hill. A pilgrim is not a pioneer. A pilgrim is not looking to civilize and to keep moving. A pilgrim looks to set down and make this place holy, and by and large, to define its community by exclusion. A pioneer, Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Manifest Destiny, Go West, Young Man, Go West. Pioneer is a great other type of American hero, and a pioneer is not a pilgrim. They're not going to a holy place, and they're not looking to settle down. They're looking to keep moving, to push the boundaries. Another thing that's not unique about America, but distinctive, is we have a frontier. England has no frontier literature, because England in its formation didn't have a frontier. And most countries, although not all, did not experience a frontier. In America, which again was a nation with a constitution and representative government and other virtues, Bill of Rights of being an American, did not really have much of a country. And the idea of the frontier was to keep moving, to push it forward. A frontier separates two pieces of a community, but it also joins them. The border between Massachusetts and Connecticut is both a divider and a connector. And a great deal of the American consciousness has to do with pushing a frontier, going into the wilderness. It didn't matter that there were people already living there. It didn't matter that some of those native peoples had civilizations much more sophisticated than the brutes that were coming in to kill them, either intentionally or by infection. The idea was, and we created a myth, we were destined to reign from sea to shining sea. So the idea of migration, of people coming a long distance to come to America, to be Americans and the hardships they face, has a long and deeply embedded history. We'll take a break. We can go to 8:30 as always, but it's often the case that there's not enough conversation to last. So we'll go for a break of 5 or 10 minutes. We'll come back, and if you have it in you to stay to 8:30 and keep talking, I'll be here. Thank you. Poor kid who went to City College, he was blown away that the Army wanted him to study at the University of Chicago. And his job was to learn Japanese so that he could be part of a group of code breakers. And he was so adept at Japanese, which they knew from his language skills in testing, he was fluent in Italian, that he was assigned to teach the officers Japanese. And a few months into that promotion, he was called into a commander's office to be told that his mother, who lived in America, was not a naturalized citizen. She was an Italian citizen. We were at war with Italy. They did not discharge him from the army. There was no dishonor attached to him, but they could not have a soldier in an information gathering intelligence unit when his mother was not a citizen. So he went back into the regular army. He, his two brothers, and his sister vowed that they would work around the clock to train their mother to pass the immigration test, the naturalization test, rather. And when the day came, 3 of the 4 children were in the courtroom with a judge who turns out to be an American hero, as you will see. There were dozens of people coming for the test, and the judge told them in the beginning, we want to honor your desire to become citizens. We know many of you have had children who have fought for America. Some have died for America. I want this to be as painless as possible. You're each going to get one question and one question only. And then he took a pause and he said, no, unfortunately, it won't be the same question for all of you. And the ones whose English was good enough laughed. And stand up, Mr. So-and-so asked him a really easy question, really easy, like who was the first president? Or, this was one of the questions, what does the U stand for in USA? He was trying to be helpful. And when my father's mother, whatever her first name, I'm blanking on it now, Mrs. Salzano stood up, nervous and proud. He said, Mrs. Salzano, who is the President of the United States? Now, it was FDR at the time, I know you've heard of him, who had been president more times than anyone, who spoke to the American people on a weekly basis. He was probably the most well-known president in his lifetime, if you discount people like Abraham Lincoln. My father-in-law and his siblings breathed a sigh of relief, and they watched his mother puff up her chest and say, Winston Churchill. Because that was the name she heard on the radio associated with the war. She didn't hear FDR giving his fireside chats. Her English wasn't good enough, but she knew that Churchill was a hero of the war. And he said, Winston Churchill. And my father-in-law's brother slapped his forehead so hard that the judge looked over at him because it made such a loud sound. And he said to him, be calm. He said to him, Mrs. Salzano, close enough. Welcome to America. That's an American story. That's a heroic judge. And you understand the whole dynamic of my father-in-law being crushed that his mother's innocence. Now, the Italian Americans weren't being put in concentration camps. It could have been far worse. But that's an American story. The other thing I want to say culturally is everybody in this room has had the experience that you think of a certain type of person, fill in the blank, as the type that you learned, however, from movies, from reading, from a biased relative, from your own experience indirectly. But until you actually meet such a person, until you know not just where they're from, but what kind of values you have. You want to learn about someone's culture? Ask them what stories they were told growing up. Don't ask them, oh, you're a Druid? What do Druids believe? What can you eat? Which holiday? That's not how people organize their life. You can be a deeply religious whatever, but you don't organize your life by your religious beliefs alone. If you ask someone, what were the stories you were told growing up? What are the values you learned through stories? You're going to learn something about them. And we all know people who are rabidly anti-blank through ignorance. And then their father needs a live-in nurse who comes from blank's country, right? They don't trust people with an accent. They don't trust people with non-white skin. And all of a sudden, a woman moves in to help your ailing parent who comes from whatever island nation. And she's a member of your family. And you love her. And without realizing it, you start to let the bias against that type break down because they're no longer a type. That's the thing, to know someone, to know a culture may not be to love them, but it helps not to hate them. And I think that's one of the things that happens in a society, like any society, where there are segregations, not just by law or inertia, but by people just stupidly thinking, I want to be where people like me are. That instinct is not stupid, but it expands into keeping other people out. I sound like I'm lecturing, but part of this novel is that Jim Burton in Virginia would never have known a Bohemian family, unlikely, and certainly would not have fallen in love, there's no other way to say it, and become a lifelong friend of this remarkable woman who by the end of the novel is associated with fecundity and the earth. She's a woman of the land. I'll stop there and ask if you have other comments.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to my desire for this book. There's one issue I have with the book, and I'd like to know if there's anyone who can speak to me about that. I had a problem with her being called Tony.
Being called?
Tony, as a nickname. To me, that didn't fit who she was. And that was a problem. Every time I saw the word Tony, I had difficulty. And it kind of went back and forth between Antonia and Tony. And I didn't quite understand that whole piece.
Yeah. Well, it's the nature of nicknames that they're often diminutive or shortening. And it's also the nature of nicknames that we get nicknames usually by people who love us. And I have grandchildren who now call me Barken, B-A-R-K-E-N, not Grandpa, but Barken, because one of my daughters, the eldest one, called me Barken after seeing a Cockney rhyming play where you don't say bark, you say quark and bark and darken, and Barken stuck. And I love it. I just want to say that the thing to remember is that when they call her Tony, it's affection and intimacy, not a reduction. And I think that's very common. Many times, parents give their children beautiful, important, maybe names that resonate with the family, and then they get reduced. I was telling Kate, wherever you are, that I was named Mark by my mother because in 1953, she wanted a name that didn't have a shortening. She wanted to be clean and clear. And a few years after I was born, one of the great breakfast cereals was Mapo. And who was the spokesperson? Marky Mapo. And everybody I knew in preschool called me Marky, and sometimes Marky Mapo. And Dwight Eisenhower's mother, I'm told, named him Dwight. White, an unusual name, because she wanted him to have a distinctively male name that had no nickname. And what did they call him? Ike. You can't win. And maybe Ike is worse than Tony, I don't know, but he was Ike for the rest of his life.
I never had a good sense of who started that name, the nickname Tony. That was my problem, I think.
Yeah, I don't know.
I remember reading it, and it did sort of shock me. I said, wait a minute, I had to go back and reread this. It was never introduced. It just was said.
Suddenly appeared, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
I thought she should have had a softer nickname, that's all. That's all my only point.
I understand. I welcome
Well,
all
that's-
comments.
That gives your imagination.
Can I call you Rocco? Are you coming?
No.
In the old world, it would have said Tony.
Sorry?
In the old world, it would have said Tony,
Tony,
and that just sort of
Yeah.
becomes Tony.
yeah.
There's one paragraph about Antonia leaving and going to Denver, and how her family supports her, and I was really struck by that they really sent her off in a grand way. They had kept her money, but they used the money to buy silver, and they really lavishly sent her off. And I think that's where some of her strength came from, because she had this family behind her. And maybe it's a little bit of the father coming back, this is what the father would have wanted for her, and they did it. It was really great. It made me feel really good about them. And it probably helped her so she could come back when it didn't work.
Yeah, give her some independence and many stories also. And maybe some of you are characters in these stories where a member of the family comes to a new community or a new country to put down roots, make a living, send money back home in order to bring the rest of the family here, sometimes for years before they're able to bring people over. And when you know the people who are being denigrated as wetbacks or whatever disreputable name you want to use, and you realize the courage and the love of family and love of the country that's not their country yet, it's really breathtaking.
It reminds me of the scene of Otto at Christmas, when he's pulling out his, the little paper dolls and all the things that he has remembered from his mother from Germany, where he was from.
Uh-huh.
Also that
Yeah.
attachment.
This may be a supposition on my part, but, Willa
Who's
Cather,
talking?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I am, right here.
I'll get you next.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was pointing.
Oh, wait. This may be a supposition on my part, but Willa Cather had a female domestic partner, and.
Yes, I mentioned that in my comments earlier.
Right, and so could it be possible that being called Tony makes her not androgynous, but more unisex? That,
Well,
I mean, that's a
you know,
big
I
supposition.
don't feel comfortable speculating about anything, let alone things about gender identity. I think it's a much more natural that someone with the name Antonia would be shortened to Tony. That's not uncommon. It's not to say that there might not be some element of truth, but the simpler explanation is probably more likely. People with the name Anthony or Tony, people with the name.
Though, if it had been spelled Toni, I think it wouldn't have bothered us as much, because that's the feminine spelling. Tony, my first thought was, oh, what guy is he talking about?
It bothered you
So maybe
the way it was
just that
spelled?
one letter.
Not bothers, but it's more implications.
Wait, are you saying it bothered you the way it was spelled?
Yeah.
Oh, I want to say this is a touchy group.
No, I'm just saying, I don't think anybody would have thought twice about it if it was Toni, because you're still talking about the girl.
Yeah, I want to say, I'm not saying this is not of interest to people in the room, but not to me. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way. Until the 18th century, people in England and some in America spelled things the way they wanted, including their own name. Your signature could be spelled different ways, and the spelling was as distinctive as the signature. Shakespeare, going back to the 17th century, is on record as having 4 signatures, 3 of which are radically different from each other. I do want to say, I do think there's so much richness in the novel to think about and talk about if there's an interest, I'll sit back and listen.
No, could you just?
I have a new point.
Okay?
When the two kids, Jim and Antonia, first meet, they're pre-teens. She's barely a teen, and he's of course younger, and it's kind of a puppy love aspect. And as the novel proceeds, I had the feeling that the author Cather wasn't doing a great job of painting Jim as a three-dimensional male.
Yeah.
I mean, he's not. There's a lack of sex in the book, and what sex there is really buried. I had a.
So now we're
mark
getting
some
down to
points.
the basics.
Yeah, exactly.
You waited for a whole hour. to tell me about this stuff. You're not from Nebraska.
No, exactly right.
I could not agree more. I do think one weakness of the novel is that Jim Burton is an instrument of narration. Nick Carraway, Holden Caulfield, Huck Finn, these people have clear identities and personalities. Jim Burton is an invention to see Antonia from a distance, from a near distance. I agree with that. And I do think it probably was true. It's still an early novel for her. She's in her 40s, but probably not completely comfortable investing him with a complicated sexuality for a young boy with a slightly older teenager.
One of the marvels of Madame Bovary, I think this is the one I'm thinking of, is that a male author really brings a female character to full life. And I don't think she doesn't do so well with that.
Yeah, I want to say there's plenty to like about the novel, but it shouldn't blind us to its weaknesses. I said once in a book group years ago with 10 women who I'm still in a book group with, that it wasn't true what one woman was suggesting, that a man can't write a novel about a woman with sensitivity except gay men. And she was thinking of Michael Cunningham's remarkable novel, The Hour. And I said, well, why do you think gay men would have an advantage? Well, I think you need a kind of feminine nature to understand women. I said, you don't believe in art? You don't believe that inspired male writers like Tolstoy can create somebody like, say, Anna Karenina or Flaubert? She said, no, I don't think a man can know what it's like to be a woman. And I said, of course you can. All of fictional art is based on knowing what people who aren't like you like. She said, you can't know that. I said, absolutely. I can't be a woman, but I can know what it's like to be a woman because they're a good writer. She said, you can't know what it's like to give childbirth. I can't give childbirth, but I can know what it's like because there are good writers about the experience, and that's how art works. And she sat back and said, I'm still friendly with this woman. Well, that's because you're a very girly man. And I said, I won't say her name, but I almost did. I said, Tony, that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me, because that is how art works. What's it like to be somebody else? The novel was created to let us know what people who aren't us, everyday regular people, are like. It lets us know what other people are like. I want to say a couple of sentences about Uncle Tom's Cabin, which you heard was added to the end of our series. So when the abolitionists in the North were energetically protesting against slavery on all kinds of grounds, economic, religious, and so on, they kept emphasizing how bad slaves were treated in the South, how they were brutalized. And they weren't making traction, say, with working class people in Boston who would freeze on the piers of the docks in the winter, working their backsides off to make a living for their family, and fantasizing that the black men and women in the South were eating watermelon and sleeping in the sun in warm climates. And what Harriet Beecher Stowe did that was new was she was saying it's not about how they're treated, it's that if you're a black person in the South, your children can be sold away from you. Your children can be sold away from you. And if any of you remember the movie 12 Years a Slave, there's a scene there that is very matter of fact of naked black men and women on display at an auction. And it is ultra civilized, and they are naked, and they are being sold, and husbands and wives are separated. And once the people of the North understood from that novel, which is a very sentimental domestic novel, very emotional, very non-intellectual, understood that what slavery did was separate families, they joined energetically in the abolitionist movement in a new way. So much so that Lincoln is rumored to have said, he probably didn't, when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, "Are you the little lady who made that great big war?" But it shows you that it was the institution of the American family and not the idea that they had better or worse working conditions that turned the tide. Uncle Tom's Cabin was so popular that it was made into a play as a music hall with blackface and minstrel and the plot. And if any of you have seen old movies where people are going across an ice floe and in the rudimentary stage they're moving sticks back and forth to show the ice flow, that's from Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was so popular that when it opened on Broadway, they couldn't get enough tickets for performances for the people who wanted to see it, so they instituted a Saturday matinee. A Saturday matinee exists on Broadway because Uncle Tom's Cabin required it as a play. Monumentally successful work, and it's a longish, longer than this, but very readable book, and I look forward to talking to you about it after we do Grapes of Wrath, which is not about immigration, but migration, another great novel. I will see you on the other side of the divide, the frontier between this year and next year. Happy holidays, however you celebrate them. Happy New Year when it comes. And I'm very glad to see so many of you out. We were at a restaurant, my friend and I, before we came here, and we were in the beginning the only two people there, and the owner said, "Well, people are shopping. Don't you people have friends to buy for?" Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
People from Nebraska, please come back. Thank you.